You'll be thrilled to know there is only one speaker between you and the next break. More coffee at the next break, or am I overselling it? Yes, I said one more speaker, and that speaker, you'll be thrilled to know, is me, in fact. And I'm in charge of the timings, so I promised to set a stopwatch so that I won't overrun. Nazreen, just rugby tackle me down if I go over time or something. Great, and hopefully I'm coming through. Yes, I think I am. I'll just stick this in my pocket. And set my stopwatch going. Brilliant, thank you. So I introduced myself at the start. I'm Raymond Holt. For those of you who didn't see my earlier presentation in the morning, I'm a lecturer in product design in the School of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Leeds, and that means I teach the engineering side, if you like, of a course. It's really about where art meets engineering, and that's because I do like my multidisciplinary work, and I like to work across disciplines. Sometimes with more success than others, it has to be said. So I'm going to forewarn you, there is in this course, this presentation, I, as an engineer, will be playing outside my sandbox and talking about things that I've learned or that I've picked up from other disciplines. You may shout at me in the break afterwards if I'm getting them horribly, horribly wrong, which is possible. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Include Centre and why I'm so excited to be part of it and why I think it's important for engineers to be involved, what I hope will come out of it. So I'll talk a little bit about me, about my background, where I'm coming from, talk about some of the importance that I see in multidisciplinary work, particularly in terms of something called the Collingridge dilemma and microscopic vision, which is concepts from engineering ethics. I'll look at some of the issues that you can experience as an engineer doing multidisciplinary work, and then I'll finish by talking a little bit about the future and my hopes for the Include Centre. So, first of all, about me. I am a mechanical engineer by background. When I first started out doing my PhD, it was going to be all about design for manufacture. How do you help designers make products that are easy to manufacture? And I very quickly got into how do designers make decisions. And I decided that I thought how humans behave was really, really interesting. And I became very interested in sort of the practicalities of how you make design tools that people are actually going to use. One of the things I would say is that I'm not a kind of hardcore engineer, if you like. I'm much more interested in kind of applying other people's exciting things. So I like to say that I have just enough engineering to prototype. I like to make things, and I like to try them out with people, and I kind of hope that other people will do the last bit of work and taking them into something that's hard and workable. For me, it's all about trying things out and discovering new things. And some of that we apply to testing out haptic perception, haptic navigation. Some of it I've been applying to areas of measuring people's motor capabilities, particularly for upper limb rehabilitation, about which a bit more in a moment. But I think it's worth understanding that for me as an engineer, I'm not really focused on one detailed area. I'm kind of a magpie. I like to go out and try different things and smush them together. Smush being the technical term, I think. After my PhD, I started getting involved in some arm rehabilitation research at the University of Leeds, where we were developing robots for upper limb rehabilitation in hospitals following stroke, and later in homes for people who had stroke or for children with cerebral palsy, and also in schools. And the reason I got involved was because they needed someone who could do the user-centered design part, and I was someone who had experience through my PhD of actually working with people and how they made decisions. So we spent time, okay, there was developing the actual robots, but there was a lot of working with clinicians, therapists, psychologists, all of whom provided a lot of technical expertise about what does it need to do, what are good exercises, also working with user groups as well. So we actually did some brainstorming and testing in schools with children with cerebral palsy. We had a regular stroke user group who would meet, try things out, give us feedback and comment on it. And that was interesting because, of course, as an engineer, you're dealing in sciences, and then you meet other people who are dealing in very different sciences, and it's fascinating seeing some of the places where these things sort of overlap, but not quite. So one thing we very quickly discovered was that as an engineer, to me, a robot can be passive or it can be active. If it is active, the robot is operating. If it is passive, the person is operating the robot. So if it's a rehabilitation robot, it's attached to the arm. Active, the robot moves the arm. Passive, the arm moves the robot. For psychologists, it's the opposite. Active means the human is active. Passive means the human is being moved. And we did not realize this until a little while in, because we were both using exactly the same term to mean exactly the opposite things. We all agreed there was an active condition and a passive condition. It took us a while to realize that we were completely confused about which one was which. But it was interesting because getting into play-based rehabilitation, I thought I really need to go and talk to people who understand a bit more about qualitative research. Who knows about qualitative research? Sociologists, I thought. I got in touch with the Centre for Disability Studies at the University of Leeds. Had a really interesting conversation with Colin Barnes, who ran the centre at the time. He has a long history in doing sort of research into lived experience of disability, and in particularly how that informs research and research into policy, so sort of research almost as a form of activism. It was an interesting conversation because we spent about an hour talking to each other. I'm not sure either of us really understood what the other said, but we felt like there was some overlap in there because a lot of us seemed to be focusing on what do people do. So I started working with another member of the centre called Angharad Beckett, who had an interest in inclusive education. And we really wanted to look at using some of this experience of making play-based experiences that we had with the rehabilitation robots and say, well, could we use some of this to actually go out into schools, get groups of disabled and non-disabled children, talk to them about what they like about play, their ideas for play, and rather than just sort of saying, hey, what would you like us to make? Because we know that they tend to just anchor on things that they already have. We developed something called the design-led interview, which probably has a different name in other fields. I'm pretty sure we're not the very first people to try it. But the idea was you would actually get kids to come up with a design, which would usually be completely infeasible, and then you would talk to them about why it was important that their classroom had to have a swimming pool with an octopus in it, and what did they want from it. But it became a way of giving them some power in the interview. And we got some funding from the Leverhulme Trust to actually go out, co-design, if you like, with groups of children, with disabled and non-disabled children, in ideas for inclusive plays, not just accessible play, but socially inclusive play. And then we would sort of take them away, try to refine them, make prototypes, take them back. Did they enjoy them as much as they did? So here the engineering was really I don't like the term probe, which is sometimes used in sociological studies. Prompt, I think, is a better way, but it became a way of getting children to play and talk and interact. It was through that I first got into the haptic navigation side of things, because I made contact with Brian Matthews, who's also part of that Centre for Disability Studies. He does a lot on transport studies. He is visually impaired, so he was very interested in could we use haptics to provide visually impaired pedestrians with better information about the environment. And he said, you know how to make prototypes? I said, yeah, sure, why not? So we started sort of setting up user groups, testing some simple prototypes with groups of people who were visually impaired. That got me involved in Suitcase, which was a much bigger beast, where I was working with people such as Astrid and Mjeta, who we've seen some of today, on the psychophysics, people working in machine vision, gamification, information sciences. And now I'm currently working on a project called Imagining Technologies for Disability Futures. It's a big project funded by the Wellcome Trust. It involves the universities of Sheffield, Exeter, Dundee, and Leeds, and we're working with Sheffield Robotics. We're working with people who do phenomenology, which is a whole new concept to me. Graham Pullen, who does some excellent work on inclusive design, and also people like Amelia DeFalco and Stuart Murray, who both, I don't quite know what the term for people in the humanities is. I was told it's scholars of the humanities. I like to call them humaniteers, but maybe that's because I'm an engineer. But what I'm saying is basically I've spent my entire career playing discipline bingo, trying to fill up a whole line on my card. I'm gradually trying to collect more and more. And maybe that's because I don't know, maybe I lack focus. But what I wanted to reflect on today is just what I've learned, because I think one of the things that we notice is that it's really complex trying to be inclusive. As Femke said, it's really hard to try and think about all of these things. And I thought that nicely illustrated one of the points I'm about to come to. So yeah, I still work with the Immersive Cognition Group, Psychologies, and the Centre for Disability Studies, the sociologists, just in case you're worried that I fell out with my early collaborators as things moved on. Why is multidisciplinary work so important? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One of them is the technical side. So actually having expertise from people like Astrid, for example, who can tell us why, you come up with all these ideas, and then you realize that all these kind of amazing haptic signals that you imagine are going to work actually aren't perceived in the same way. And actually, knowing how to design experiments correctly is really important. The same working with psychologists, work with different disciplines of engineers. Again, even working with sociologists in designing studies, how do people do policy studies, understanding how things pull together. But I think there's also, this is going to sound really pompous now, like an attitudinal element to it. And just to try and explain what I mean, is anyone here familiar with the Collingridge dilemma? No, lots of blank faces. It is the idea, it was first put forward by David Collingridge back in 1980. And what he said is this: as an engineer, one of the things you learn early on is that the easiest time to make changes to a design is early in the process, before you've locked everything in. The trouble is, early in the design process, you don't know what the impacts or the social impacts of that technology are going to be, because you don't yet know exactly how it's going to shape up, never mind how people are going to use it. When do you find out? The answer is when it's been released and people are using it, and may be dependent on it. And at that point, you now have a power problem. You can't change the technology very easily. I think social media might be, or the internet might be a good example of that, because at the moment, there's a lot of people thinking, oh man, okay, maybe we wouldn't have started from here. But that's the nature of development, right? You don't have a crystal ball. We are what's called boundedly rational. Again, this comes from Herbert Simon, really thinking about kind of economic rationality. But I really liked it because it's the idea that actually, even as an engineer, you can't know everything. You can't hold all of that information in your head at the same time. And one of the problems, particularly in engineering design, where it used to be all about design for manufacture, design for assembly. Now we're very interested in sustainable design, inclusive design. A lot of it is just trying to think about more and more and more and more and more and more things as you make trade-offs. And that makes the trade-offs very, very complicated. And that's difficult, particularly where you've got, when you have groups of people, it's easier to have multiple groups of expertise. You're going to get into, okay, how do we manage the social dynamics and the knowledge gaps in a moment, but at least if you have a variety of perspectives reflected, you're not relying on one discipline having that huge range of knowledge. And certainly in engineering ethics, one of the things or one of the concepts that I liked was this idea of microscopic vision. So as engineers, I suspect in academia generally, but we tend to specialize. If you looked at I don't know how many of you took in the V model of systems engineering that was very briefly flashed up in John Clarkson's talk. I can see Andy, my fellow engineer, is nodding sagely. It basically shows the way in which in complex complex systems, you have to break them down into subsystems, and ideally those subsystems are independent of each other, so you can merge them back at the end. Now, okay, in practice it rarely works like that, but that's sort of the ideal. The danger is that means that everybody's got a very narrow focus. You're focusing on one little area, and that comes at the expense of breadth. And the danger is now you're thinking, because you're just thinking about this one small area, you're not thinking about the wider implications, which actually makes the Collingridge dilemma worse. So my hope is that by working with a wide range of disciplines, you get more people involved in the discussion, you get more challenged about your own microscopic vision. And in some ways, I really like this idea of the engineering imagination, which I stole from the idea of the sociological imagination, which is a big thing in sociology. C. Wright Mills wrote a book, The Sociological Imagination, in the 1950s, which really kind of transformed sociology. As I understand it, sociologists may have a different view. But he was saying, well, a lot of sociological research is really about how can we make people fit the mold? How do we raise people to be good people? How do we make them correct? Rather than exploring how are they? And what Wright Mills wanted to do is to link personal problems with systemic issues. So it was this kind of link between the individual and wider society, and the fact that focusing on just one or the other isn't very helpful. I thought, actually, that's quite nice because it sort of captures some of what I'm thinking about, which is, as an engineer, you're trying to think about, well, I'm making all of these detailed individual decisions, but I'm interested in the effects on a wider society, which may be difficult to predict or difficult to understand, especially if your particular expertise is in how things physically interact with each other, for example. So yeah, I like the idea of the engineering imagination. I don't really know how we encourage it in engineers, but I sort of feel like working across disciplines, working. There was a great phrase Femke used, actually, was it sharing curiosities, which I thought was great. So maybe actually sharing curiosities with user groups, actually working with them rather than seeing them as somebody at the distance and I'll give you the requirements and I'll go away and solve the problem is a nice way of doing it. But that's what I'm grappling with. It's not all plain sailing in multidisciplinary work, and I'm conscious that we're getting on towards break time, so I shall be brief. I'll just say it's dead easy, and then we can go. Yeah, everyone has there's different jargon, okay? I've mentioned passive and active in the concept of rehabilitation robots, but it's not just that. The way each of our disciplines has its own assumptions, its own mental models of the world, we really internalize these. That's been my experience. Maybe everybody else is having a different experience, but it just means you look at the world in different ways. And when you arrive and try to talk to each other, that makes things difficult because you don't ask the same research questions, you don't use the same methods, you don't have the same ideas of what research is. There is a danger. I come from the northeast of England, and there was a shop, or used to be a shop in a town there, which said specialists in everything, which drives me absolutely nuts because it's, yeah, how can you specialize in everything? But it is a danger, and it is one of the things I feel is that, you see so many interesting, oh yes, I'd love to do some of that, I'd love to do some of that. But then the danger is you become kind of very general rather than someone who has a speciality but is able to work with other people. There's also the danger, of course, of taking lots of concepts from other disciplines and starting to smoosh them together into your own random theories that you then come to workshops like this to present about. So I'm just saying. But also, it's I don't know, it's there's that question, okay, we can't do everything. And I sometimes, I think particularly, it's one thing, if you are working directly on assistive technologies or inclusive design or design that's very directly works with users, it's clearly important that you need to consider that range of users. There's going to be a whole range of socio-technical issues that you need to address or be aware of as an engineer, because it's very difficult to shield yourself from, unless you've got somebody who's very good at doing that, then turning it into a technical specification that you can respond to. So someone needs to be managing that process. On the other hand, if you're working at a much higher level, like if you develop GPS antenna, so I worked on a project on tracking people, looking at the design of tracking systems. And this was interesting because I thought, well, actually, there's a very different set of issues faced by the people who develop GPS receivers and, the global navigation satellite systems compared to the people who are actually designing the tags that are going to be used to track people for criminal justice purposes. So I think it's not the case that everyone needs to be thinking about everything, or that every engineer needs to be thinking about, okay, you do need to give some thought to what are the social implications of what I'm doing, but I don't think that's going to look the same for every project and every development. And again, the difficulty is how do you get the right focus at the right time? So let me end on an optimistic note before we go and treat ourselves to some more coffee. Yeah, what are my hopes for Include? Well, I mean, part of the reason for being excited by the centre is precisely, I think, the line that that Femke gave. Actually, she sort of stole my thunder there, but in a very nice way, which is, the opportunity to work together with different people, to learn from them, to get my perspectives challenged. And as well, I just love that phrase, sharing curiosity. So I'm gonna use it again. I think it's a great opportunity for us to share our curiosities. And what I hope is that we won't just be inward focused and academic, because there is that danger. I know what it's like being an academic, and we do get wagged by the tail wagging the dog because of the funding system, which encourages us to, we've got to get grants, we've got to produce papers. Where's the impact? Where's the paper? But I hope we will focus on sharing curiosities precisely with people like Femke and giving them a very active role in the centre and allowing them to drive what we do, rather than seeing them as actually just using the phrase "them" actually sounds kind of bad, but seeing this as being something that's kind of okay. People outside the centre are users who kind of feed into it, and we will feed back out. Actually, I think we need to make sure it's a broad church, and we have people who we are very actively working with and serving. And I think that is a good place for me to stop and release everyone. So thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy coffee.